All right, kids, they say if you don't do politics, politics will do you. And actually, there's a book by Niven Pasma with that same title written as A Guide to Navigating Office Politics Effectively and Ethically, written in 2020. When so many learned that even while working remotely, away from the office, we still got to learn how to deal with that one coworker.
I probably like Ted Cruz more than most of my colleagues like Ted Cruz, and I hate Ted Cruz.
A good Republican would defend Ted Cruz after tonight. That ain't happening. If you killed Ted Cruz on the floor of the Senate, and the trial was in the Senate, nobody can convict you.
She just said a terrible thing. You know what she said? Shout it out, because I don't want to... Okay, you're not allowed to say, and I never expect to hear that from you again. She said, I never expect to hear that from you again. She said he's a pussy. That's terrible. Terrible.
Ted Cruz, the worst U.S. senator. Now, former Speaker of the House John Boehner called Cruz Lucifer in the flesh and added that he has Democrat friends and Republican friends. He gets along with almost everyone. But, quote, I have never worked with a more miserable son of a bitch in my life. People on the internet have taken this, if I had a gun with 2 bullets and I was in a room with Hitler, Bin Laden, and Toby, quote, from The Office, and applied it to Ted Cruz, saying that they would shoot the senator twice. And co-founder of The Hill, Rick Wilson, said, we all know Ted Cruz is sort of a political force of nature. He is what he is. You either hate him or you hate him. So today, let's talk about how Ted Cruz can be a political force, while so many, including fellow congresspeople in his political party, hate him, along with what makes him the worst senator, or simply just, period, the worst. This episode is going to look and sound a little different because I usually do social commentary instead of political here. However, just because you do not take an interest in politics doesn't mean politics won't take an interest in you. One of the penalties of refusing to participate in politics is that you end up being governed by your inferiors. And if you're not turned on by politics, politics will turn on you. Not just that, I typically focus on Black people, Blackness, and minorities by extension in the US. But see, that's the thing about it. Raphael Edward Cruz was born in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. His mother is an American woman who is of 3/4 Irish and 1/4 Italian descent. And his father was born and raised in Cuba, the son of a Canary Islander who immigrated to Cuba as a child. He would later leave Cuba and obtain political asylum in the United States. Plus, he earned Canadian citizenship and became a naturalized United States citizen. So yeah, Raphael is a minority who anglicized his name for the sake of whiteness. Like Nimrata, what do you want me to say about slavery, Haley? Before I continue, she's currently campaigning to become president, but maybe in the running to be the worst governor. Oh, and let me know if y'all want me to do a video about the worst House representative. Maybe easy. Anyways, you may know Ted Cruz from his work of getting booed. Cruz is used to getting booed up. Shout out to Ella May. And confronted in public for who he is and what he does. I first came to know who Ted Cruz was when he was running for president in the summer of 2015 while watching Vice, when Elliot Page, formerly Ellen Page, confronted him while he was wearing an apron and holding a pork sandwich at the Iowa State Fair.
It's interesting right now. Do you know where gay people are being persecuted right now? ISIS.
All over the world.
But ISIS is executing gay people. Iran is executing homosexuals.
Yes.
And on the left, you hear complete silence about Iran hanging homosexuals, and yet the Obama administration is sending over $100 billion to a regime that murders homosexuals.
That started out as Page stating that the LGBTQ plus community is worried that something like religious liberty or religious freedom bills in particular will be used to discriminate against queer people like they were in the past with Black people. And it somehow turned into governmental bodies of Iran and ISIS executing gay people for being homosexual, and the Obama administration not standing against them. What I want to focus on is Ted Cruz claiming, well, what we're seeing right now, we're seeing Bible-believing Christians being persecuted for living according to their faith. So Christian biblical persecution involved death, martyrs for the faith, at the hands of a governmental body like Rome. Think the early church at large, Stephen, maybe Peter and Paul, and Jesus. There's getting stoned to death and being flogged versus being forced to bake a cake for a gay couple or a Jewish rabbi forced to perform a Christian wedding. With that said, I'm actually partially with Ted Cruz on this. A business shouldn't be forced to do anything, really. Although, I'm a little confused as to why these same peoples aren't refusing service to Confederates and Nazis. Somebody help me with that. It's weird. Christianity and racism cannot coexist. And where did religion go wrong when gay kids grow up fearing God's wrath, but racists don't? And since we're playing around with terminology, if anybody's doing some persecuting around here, it's evangelicals. None of what Ted Cruz spoke about at the Iowa State Fair that day aligns with scripture. And the hate displayed towards queer communities isn't in line with what God hates. Quote, there are 6 things the Lord hates, 7 that are detestable to him. Haughty eyes, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked schemes, feet that are quick to rush into evil, a false witness who pours out lies, and a person who stirs up conflict in the community. Do with that information what you will. Just know this. Ted Cruz really doesn't want to have a back and forth debate. He said it to Page when they confronted him, and Page acknowledged it later on. Keep that in mind as we move forward to a time after Trump called Ted Cruz's wife ugly, said his dad killed JFK, and Ted had to drop out of the presidential race. This embarrassment, and then got booed at the 2016 Republican National Convention for telling the GOP to vote with their conscience when he was supposed to endorse Trump. He knew and he knows what Trump is. But don't worry, Ted Cruz will go on to support former, maybe future President Donald Trump, uphold unsubstantiated claims that the 2020 presidential election was stolen, and even went so far as to refuse to certify the election because, according to him, the American people were weary of the election results, aka those that he told to be weary about the election results. Then came the storming of the Capitol by Trump supporters on January 6, 2021, which Cruz first referred to as a violent terrorist attack on the Capitol, where we saw the men and women of law enforcement demonstrate incredible courage. Until he didn't.
The way I phrased things yesterday, it was sloppy and it was frankly dumb. And
I don't buy that. Whoa. I don't buy that. Look, I've known you a long time, since before you went to the Senate. You were a Supreme Court contender. You take words as seriously as any man who's ever served in the Senate. And every word you repeated that phrase. I do not believe that you used that accidentally. Like, why'd you use that word? You're playing into the other side's characterization.
When I tell you that Ted Cruz doesn't want a back and forth debate.
You have sat there for a year and watched people use language to distort the events of that day. Intentionally. Insurrection. Coup.
Of course it
terrorism.
wasn't an insurrection. Saying it's an insurrection is a political term. It's a lie. I've repeatedly denounced it.
Sometime after his appearance with Tucker Carlson, Teddy said, I think it is a mistake for Republicans to repeat the political propaganda of Democrats and the corporate media, and referring to J6 as an insurrection. But the thing about what Tucker said is, violence is a part of many coups, but being violent is not a necessary condition. Out of the 12 types of coups recognized by the Klein Center for Advanced Social Research out of the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, 9 do not seem to have anything to do with what Trump is talking about, including military coups, rebel coups, popular revolts, dissident actions, palace coups, foreign coups, internationally meditated transitions, forced resignations, and self-coups, in which the leader strong-arms other branches of government to entrench power. Not sure of how much the definitions of insurrection and coup matter when both methods could have been used by MAGA to overturn the results of a free and fair election. Whether weapons were involved doesn't change that fact. Speaking of weapons,
if you want to stop violent crime, the proposals the Democrats have, none of them would have stopped this.
But why does this only happen in your country? I really think that's what many people around the world just, they cannot fathom. Why only in America? Why is this American exceptionalism so awful?
You know, I'm sorry you think American exceptionalism is awful.
I think this aspect of it.
You got your political agenda.
No, it's honestly,
God love you.
Senator, it's...
I can't stress enough. Ted Cruz doesn't want a back and forth debate. Now, this clip occurred 2 days after a gunman killed 19 children and 2 adults at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas. Cruz was attending a vigil for the victims. As you may have noticed, Ted Cruz went from wanting to not politicize mass shootings to saying that Democrat policies wouldn't have prevented one or fixed one. Cruz also likes to say that Democrat policies take guns out of the hands of law-abiding citizens. And if he has ever named those policies, sorry, I must have missed it. If you were to tell him to name two, just two, and gave him one, gun-free zones, which doesn't really fit, he would still be stuck. We've talked about how gun laws work here on this channel, and you can tell they do based on data from firearm death rates and homicide rates by state. Liberal states with more strict laws tend to do better than their conservative counterparts with more lax laws. By the way, Ted Cruz definitely has an agenda, and back in 2017, he accidentally explained America's gun law problem in one sentence, saying, "Evil is evil is evil, and will use the weaponry that is available," like firearms in a country that has more guns than people. He has introduced gun bills before. He's also proposed putting armed guards in schools, saying, "We know from past experiences that the most effective tool for keeping kids safe is armed law enforcement on the campus." And no, we don't. No, we don't. To give Teddy some credit, when he was challenged by this man in public over gun control, Cruz stood his ground, no pun intended. He was helped by some of his handlers or passersby, nice of them. Furthermore, Cruz didn't run away when things got hot. His thing is abandoning Texas for Cancun when things get really, really cold. But let's assume he didn't end things with this man with, "You've got your agenda." You know what? I should show you Ted Cruz going on the offensive.
In 2020, the last year of the Trump presidency, we had the lowest rate of illegal immigration in 45 years. You ask, what have I done? I've championed the men and women of Border Patrol. I've championed securing the border. I've championed Remain in Mexico. And we turned this problem around and solved it. And we went from Joe Biden inherited the lowest rate of illegal immigration in 45 years.
See how things are different and better for Ted Cruz when people aren't exchanging with him? And he's got a hype man nodding with him off to the side like they're listening to Ted's demo or something. Cruz was speaking at a press conference in Brownsville, Texas, while visiting a border detention facility in the Rio Grande Valley. This took place in May of 2023, hours before the immigration restrictions known as Title 42 expired. Title 42 allowed border agents to rapidly turn back many migrants to Mexico without a chance to ask for asylum. Some say it was part of Trump's goal of curbing legal and illegal immigration. President Joe Biden took office in 2021, vowing to reverse Trump's restrictive approach, but kept Title 42 in place and expanded it. Before that, there was the Remain in Mexico policy, which was enacted in 2019 and led to thousands of asylum seekers being forced to await their immigration hearings in Mexico, hence the name Remain in Mexico. People seeking asylum from dangerous conditions is a constitutional right. Denying this right it's wrong. Unconstitutional even. The increase in the amount of immigrants coming to the U.S. through the southern border started under 45. The GOP pretends like we have an open border here in the U.S., but then acts like it's a bad thing when there's a record number of fentanyl seized and migrants arrested and sent back. I mean, sure, this is another indication that there's a lot more people crossing over from Mexico than ever in the history of this country. But Biden's and Trump's border policies are almost the same. And didn't I just see that the Biden administration wanted to expand the border wall? What do I know? Ted Cruz is the one who went to the border himself, bravely scoping out conditions and could even hear the cartels behind him. For some reason, they didn't give the violence that he speaks of to him, despite seeing his camera light. Can't stand Mexicans coming over, but he loves to go to Cancun. Honestly, I couldn't have presented all this baseline information about border policy had I been one of the reporters out there with Cruz. I looked it up after the fact since what he said didn't seem right. But gun reform, J6, and whatever nonsense he said about Christian persecution, I would have been ready to go back and forth with him. All of that to say, this man needs to be confronted and challenged to his face, wherever and whenever possible, with respect to his popularity, power, and influence. Admittedly, when watching him grill people during congressional hearings, I was impressed. Then again, those providing testimony can't go on the offensive against him. He can dish it, he can't take it. Easy for me to say from the comfort of my living room, being real as a YouTuber, but he leverages his platform in order to advocate for partisanship. That's it. It's all good. He should own it. He's like a lot of people in Congress on both sides of the aisle. However, at the end of the day, Ted Cruz is trying to promote his podcast just like the rest of us.
Some of y'all know I do every week a podcast.
I do every week a podcast.
I do a podcast every week.
I do a podcast 3 days a week. I do a podcast.
I do a podcast.
I do a podcast.
Last year I launched a podcast. 2 years ago I launched a podcast. 3 years ago I launched a podcast.
I do a podcast, my last podcast, today's podcast on the podcast.
Podcast on my podcast.
Back to Ketanji Brown Jackson's confirmation hearing.
You know, a couple of years ago I was doing my weekly podcast.
My podcast, 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 podcast.
If you're a grifter, you got to grift.
Trump and Tucker expose him for who he is. He's also just awkward. Here he is messing up a handhold with his vice president pick, Carly Fiorina. See him trying and failing to kiss his daughter. Then there's this. Ted Cruz might be the type of dude who would introduce an amendment to an immigration bill which would have kept his own father out of the country. He's the type of dude to complain about leftists being irresponsible people who don't hold themselves accountable and lack family values while endorsing Herschel Walker for Senate. Ted Cruz is the type of dude who won't advocate for the needs of the LGBTQ+ communities, even though his child could be queer. I'm certain I've proven that Ted Cruz is the worst, despite not comparing or contrasting him to others in his position at all. I didn't even go into detail about Ted blaming his child for the reason why he went to Cancun in the middle of an ice storm while his constituents died. With that said, whoever you think the worst senator is, you're right. Look, I wanted to start the year off by talking about politics because of how important 2024 is. There's an ongoing genocide, and not only is there a presidential election, but Ted Cruz is up for re-election too. He reintroduced a bill to limit senators from serving more than 2 6-year terms, but that don't mean he'll retire before he runs for his third. And before he's gone, he needs to continue to feel our presence. He's fine in a manufactured setting where he can pantomime being a normal beer-drinking American man. He's a lot different outside of safe spaces, echo chambers, and filter bubbles. This isn't to say that debates do or mean anything. What's somebody going to do this day and age when they're proven to be wrong? Change their mind? But the principles I've used here in this video can be applied to senators, representatives, governors, any politician on the federal, state, and local level. They often repeat their same talking points over and over. Read up on them, do the knowledge, then use it against them. Also, vote. We should probably focus more on the people who will determine laws in our own neighborhoods, though. Share what you know about these people with others. And if you aren't ready for debates, discussions, discourses, or dialogues, it's okay. Boo these politicians mercilessly. We're gonna be all right.
Show me something or someone that would be a better senator than Ted Cruz.
I actually think Ted Cruz is a pretty good senator given the circumstances, and I don't really get all the hate for him on TikTok. Like, it would be really hard to be in the U.S. Senate and not be a human being. And of course, Ted Cruz is 16 undead weasels who formed an alliance and live inside of a suit. Is he one of the 5 worst U.S. senators? Yes, of course. But he is the best U.S. senator who is 16 zombie weasels inside of a suit, right? Give the guy a fucking break.